Caiaphas was the high priest during the time of Jesus. He was the most powerful, most influential person in Jerusalem, in Judea, and what we would consider ancient Israel. He was the guy. He was the connecting point between the nation of Israel and Rome. He was the person that communicated with Pilate or whoever the leader in the Roman garrison was at whatever point he was in leadership. But even more significant than that, Caiaphas was part of a family, and it's hard to describe the significance of this. Caiaphas was part of a family that controlled the temple, the politics, the religion, and the power of the temple for 40 years because his father-in-law was a high priest and 5 of his brothers-in-law were high priests. So this was basically a dynasty. They had all the power, they had all the influence, and they had extraordinary wealth. There were amazing financial perks that came with being at the epicenter of Jewish religion in the first century because Jews all over the world paid what was called a temple tax. And the equivalent of millions upon millions of dollars flowed into this 32-acre piece of real estate known as the temple in the middle of Jerusalem. So Caiaphas not only had extraordinary power, he had extraordinary influence because he had extraordinary access to extraordinary wealth. And things went along just fine for Caiaphas, the high priest, until a carpenter turned rabbi stepped onto the pages of history. We know him as Jesus Josephson. When Jesus showed up, here's the thing, and this is why you should read the Bible, you should read the New Testament. When Jesus showed up, the problem was, Caiaphas has all this power, he's got all this wealth, all this influence, he's in the family that controls everything. When Jesus showed up, the problem with Jesus was the crowds. It wasn't his teaching. People taught all kind of crazy things. It was the crowds. Everywhere Jesus went, there were crowds. We know the story from growing up in church, most of us, of Jesus feeding the 5,000. There were 5,000 men. People say there were 10,000 people. Some people say that's hyperbole. There were only 5,000 or 2,000. It doesn't matter. Everywhere Jesus went, there were at least hundreds and often thousands of people. And this was a threat to Rome, and this was a threat to the Jewish system because crowds meant potential insurrection, crowds meant division, crowds potentially meant civil war, crowds meant that things may not go well, and they may not go well quickly if a crowd suddenly turned on the Jewish leaders or turned on the Roman garrison. So the Romans were concerned about the crowd, and Caiaphas and his posse were concerned about the crowd, but everywhere Jesus went, he drew huge crowds. And Caiaphas and his group, they never drew a crowd, except on festival days. And they knew that people weren't there to see them or hear them. They were simply there because it was a festival. And the other thing that was a problem in terms of Jesus and his relationship with Caiaphas was that when Jesus spoke, and when Jesus acted and behaved, he spoke with such extraordinary authority. People were just amazed by his authority. In fact, remember that story of Jesus going into the temple and turning over the tables and chasing off all the cows and letting the doves go and, kind of wreaking havoc there and with the money changers in the temple. When the religious leaders sent by Caiaphas approached Jesus, they did not say, "What do you think you're doing?" They asked the question that they knew they needed to ask. They said, "Who do you think you are?" Because Jesus acted, behaved, and spoke with such extraordinary authority. But the other problem with Jesus is Jesus was extraordinarily critical of the religious leaders. Now, if you want to know what a Jesus rant looks and sounds like, if you get your Bible later, not now, and turn to Matthew chapter 23, it is a rant. Jesus had no respect for the temple leaders. Jesus had no respect because of the corruption that had happened inside the temple system by the time he showed up in history. He was all about criticizing it. And in Matthew 23, it just goes on and on and on. And at the end of this rant against these religious leaders, including Caiaphas, the high priest, here's what he says. This kind of caps it all off. He says, "You snakes, you brood of," this is Jesus talking. You wouldn't let your kids talk like this, okay? "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" In other words, he says to the religious leaders, the people that get up every day and try to be good, the people who are responsible for leading the people who, oversee the sacrificing of animals so that they can find atonement for their sin. He looks at, quote, the best people in the city and he says, "You are going to hell." So it's no wonder that Caiaphas had a little problem with Jesus, his authority, the crowds, and his criticism of everybody that Caiaphas worked with and potentially had respect for. That Jesus threatened the peace and Jesus personally threatened the peace keepers.